In this tutorial, I'll review how to apply a custom color palette to an image based on its tonal range using Photoshop. Then I'll review how to create color separations for each of these colors for use in screen printing or other applications. So let's get started. I've chosen this image of a porcupine fish that I shot while scuba diving, and I'm interested maybe in creating a screen print of this fish using my own custom spot colors. So I need to apply that custom color palette to see what it's going to look like potentially as a finished product, and I need to color separate out each of the spot colors that I want to use. I'm going to begin here by duplicating the background. I always like to keep a copy of the original in case I mess with it. And then for this image, I'm going to turn it into black and white because I'm really just interested in the tonal range here. So I could adjust how that changes. So if I adjust some of the color sliders, you'll see you can get a little bit lighter or darker. You can add a little contrast. So I'll find a place where I think it looks okay, and I'll go ahead and accept that. The other thing I'd like to do is adjust the levels here. I actually want this to have a little bit higher contrast. So I'm going to bring in the white highlight point to have more highlights. I'm going to have some more darks in this image. And I could also adjust the outputs here to have a little lighter or darker options here. And then I want to actually posterize this to convert it to the number of colors that I actually want to use. And so I'm going to go back to my adjustment layers and choose the posterize option. And if I posterize this with only two colors, obviously that will be a threshold where I just get black and white. And then for this, however, I think I want actually 5 tones, and that would include the shadows, the 3/4 tones, the mid-tones, the quarter tones, and the highlights, which is maybe a good number and gives me a pretty rich range of colors to work with. Now, if I wanted to make sure that I had, like, if I felt like I needed more sort of darks or blacks in this, I could go back to my levels and sort of readjust this a little bit. Maybe I feel like I want a little bit more dark in this. I could use that sort of midpoint slider. I could play around with this to get kind of the mix of lights and darks that I'm looking for this particular image. Another thing that I might want to do is simplify the image a bit. So this would work on its own, but I've got like quite a few just individual random pixels like these ones right here, right, that are just sort of by themselves. I don't love that for a screen print where I just get maybe a single dot of color right there. So I really want kind of bigger groups or a little bit more simplicity for this. Now, this isn't a requirement per se, but what I'd like to do is actually simplify my image. So I'm going to convert my main image here into a smart object so that I can apply filters non-destructively to that. So I right-clicked and said convert to smart object, and then I'll come up here and apply some filters to this. The one that I'm interested in particular is the oil paint filter. And so oil paint will kind of simplify and group a lot of the pixels that are sort of rogue together. Sometimes I can use some blurring for this, but I don't really want to blur the image too much. If it was a face, I might use some surface blur, for example. But I'm going to choose oil paint here and take a look at the stylization that I can get through that oil paint. I could adjust that with the sliders. I want to make sure that I don't turn on the lighting because that's going to be way different than I'm looking for here. So I'm going to keep the lighting off, which means really that the scale and the bristle detail pretty much do nothing. They're more affected by the lighting, but I can have more or less stylization of this if I wanted sort of a little more or a little less. But one of the things that I really sort of want to, play with the cleanliness here as well. I want to keep kind of some of the style of this image, but this, as you'll see, if we preview this on and off, instead of all these individual sort of rogue pixels, they kind of get swept together and grouped together and simplified. And that's what I'm looking for in this case. So I see that I have a few odd places, like right down here, like it feels like the fish sort of bleeds into the background a little bit. I don't love that, and I might clean this image up a bit in order to continue working with it. One way that I could do that, of course, is with the levels. Like I might look at that area and like, can I turn that, to pure black at a certain point? Maybe I would just want some more darks on there, or I could actually go to the image itself and sort of paint a little darker on there. So that's one thing I could do, is just literally open up a layer of black paint and just sort of paint out a couple of the pieces that I don't want right there. So I could just get rid of that to kind of make sure that this is looking more or less like I want. And so I'm going to accept this as is because I don't want to get too deep into messing with it. But that posterization gives me 5 different tones that I can work with now. And what I'd like to do is apply a unique color to each of those tones. So at this point, I need to start with my color separations. To do that, I'm going to stamp what I've got currently. So that really is merging and copying all the layers into one, but I can do that with an easy quick key of Control Alt Shift E if I'm on a PC, and Command Shift Alt E on a Mac. And what that did is it gave me a stamp of that image. You'll see that I can turn everything else off. I just got basically a merged version of that. And underneath that merged version, I'm going to go ahead and put a solid color fill of just white so that I have white under the image. And I'm going to duplicate this sort of merged version and work with the copy on top. I'm going to turn off my original. I'm going to keep that sort of original. I might even call it my sort of original. And I'm going to work now with sort of creating the shadows, let's say. So I'll start with the shadows. And in order to color separate this out, there's a few different ways I could do that. Now, one thing that you see people doing sometimes is they'll select colors based on a kind of color range, and I could sample out, for example, if I bring in my color insider, I could simply sample out the darks of the range. So that would sort of work. It's now, depending on my level of fuzziness as well, but I could select the darks and then adjust like how much of the darks I'm getting. Honestly, I find this to be a little bit imprecise now that I've got a tonal range with clear darks. That's not exactly what I want. Other people will sometimes use, the magic wand selections to sort of do color range. What I'd like to do here, though, is to actually use the blending options. So I can click on my effects blending options, or I could just double click on the layer, just not on the name, and open my layer styles panel, which gives me those blending options. And what I'd like to do is actually only keep the darks. And so I'm going to use this blend if. And if I take my slider down, you'll see that some of the different colors start to drop away. The highlights drop away, the mid-tones, the shadows, and I end up only with the shadows. And I want to see exactly the range until my sort of other tones pop back, which is somewhere right around 63 or so that they come back in, and I want to go just under that. So I'll go to 61 right here. So at that point, I only have my darks or my shadows. And so that's what I want for this particular one, only to have the shadows. The next thing I'll do is duplicate my original. Again, I'll pop that on the top. And so this time I'm going to actually get just my 3/4 tones. And so I want sort of the 3/4 tones. I'll write that here, 3/4. I'll call it, and then I'll use the blending options again. I could do the effects blending options or double click on that layer to bring that up. And so in this case, I want it where I only have those sort of dark grays. And so I'm going to do my slider until the next tone pops in, which is somewhere right here around 126, 127, right? So I'll bring my slider to 126. Now, all of the tones that are left are either the shadows or the 3/4 tones. If I'm overprinting, I could actually do this where I let the 3/4 tones, if I'm worried about trapping, for example, and having gaps, I could actually just leave all of this and print it all as a 3/4 tone color, and then overprint my shadows on top of that. And then there'd be no gaps between the shadows and the 3/4 tones. So that would be one strategy. Or if I wanted to do a knockout here and only have the 3/4 tones, what I can do is grab the slider to the left and get rid of my shadows. I'm going to bring the slider all the way up to kind of where the sort of three-quarter tones started, so right around here. And what I'm left with is really just those three-quarter tones. So I've got now this, and if I turn off my layer underneath, you'll see that there's just transparency there for these particular elements. And I want to do this for each of the tonal ranges. So again, I'm going to duplicate the original. So each sort of tone within the range. And so now I want the half tones, and I'll double click to bring up my blending options. I'll bring my slider in from the left to get rid of the shadows and the three-quarter tones. So I'm going to bring that in one direction, and I had that right into about 127, I think, is where those other ones kind of get lost or disappear. So I want to bring that sort of right before that. And then this other way, I'll get rid of the highlights and the quarter tones. So the quarter tones right around here, 190, in there, 189, they seem to disappear. So all of this is really my mid-tones, my mid-grays. So I'll go ahead and click OK and maybe name that sort of the mid-tones. All right, let's keep going. Duplicate the original, drag it to the top. Do the same thing here with the quarter tones, and so double click, and I'll bring this to all the way back where all I have is these quarter tones. I don't want to see sort of where those appear or disappear, and kind of keep the slider right around there. Now I could in theory get rid of the lights, but I'm not going to see that because I've got the color fill on. So I'd have to turn off this color fill channel in order to see that. So if I do that, I could kind of turn off that color fill channel and make sure that my blending options doesn't include any of the highlights either. So I'll go ahead and turn these highlights off and just sort of leave the quarter tones in. So I'll take a look at where I've got this sort of slider. So I'll say that the highlights are everything above maybe 230 in that case. Okay, so I've got that one. These are the quarter tones. And then lastly, I need just my highlights. And so the highlights themselves could be everything that's left over, right? I could leave that just as white. In that case, I could really just put that as the paper color perhaps. Or if I want to, I could make sure to actually have a color separation for those highlights. And so I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'll drag this to the top, turn off the quarter tones here, and then double click to get my blending options, and simply bring this all the way to where I had it right around 230 or so. I was saying were the highlights. So I've just got some highlights, not very many. And so I could, depending if I wanted more highlight points, I might actually readjust my tonal range to have a little bit more lights in this particular image. I'm going to click OK at that point. So I've got actually each of these layers. If we stack them on top of each other, you'll see that we've got our shadows, we've got the quarter tones, we've got the mid-tones, the quarter tones, and the highlights here. And each of those are now separated out. I'm interested in applying my own sort of custom color palette to this in order to kind of see what this will look like. Plus, at this point, I couldn't just print these to transparencies, because in this, it'd be just white. So I actually need to have, for doing color separations, I need each of these sort of channels, if you will, or each of these colors to all be represented by black, and black only, or black and white only. And so I'll work to do that as well. And we'll talk just a little bit about setting traps on here as well, so that as we're overprinting or printing, we don't have gaps between our content. So Right now I could actually see if I have some gaps in here, and I could do that by taking my color fill and maybe like putting it to some really bright color like red. And you can see that I don't see anything coming through on the digital print, but it would come through if, for example, let's say I looked at these quarter tones and I readjusted these. You'll see that if I get this in the wrong spot, they disappear, right? And we're actually seeing the background come through. So I want to make sure that I don't do that with those particular tones. All right. So I want to apply some custom colors to these, and I also want them to be fully separated. And so to do that, I'm going to take these and what I'll do here is convert this into a smart object. And by converting, in this case, I only did the highlights into a smart object. What I could do with that smart object now is be able to select just the highlights. And to do that, I can simply hit Control when I click on the thumbnail, and you'll see I get a little selection cursor. And so you'll see that now when I click to select, I am just getting the highlights. At this point, I could create, for example, like a solid color fill, and I could choose to have a black fill for that. Like if I was printing to transparency, for example, like if I turn all this off, you'll see that I actually have, and I'll make a background layer that is just white. I could actually make a print now of this with just the highlights, but printed for onto a transparency in black, so I could burn burn emulsion and create my screen for screen printing. And that would represent the highlights of this. Now, if I wanted to expand my highlights so that they overlapped or that they had, a little bit more of a trap to them, I could do that as well. And the way that I would do that is actually, I'm going to go ahead and reselect. So basically, I've got a mask in here with all of the highlights, and I'm masking the, everything. If I turn off the mask, you see it just, everything is black, but with the mask, I get that. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Control and reselect those highlights. And what I could do is actually create like a layer here where I stroke those. So I could add a stroke, and I don't want it on the inside. Actually, I like the idea of having this maybe on the center, where I'm going to add about a 2 pixel stroke, and that would actually expand all of the highlights just a little bit, right? So they all get just a bit bigger. You can see that what that stroke would do if I was expanding them out. In theory, I could fill this as well with just sort of, I'm going to hit Edit Fill and just fill with black, so that that layer by itself represents all of, and I can deselect now, it represents all of the highlight points. All right, so that's one way I could sort of get the color separation out. For right now, though, I'm just going to keep this without sort of thinking about the trapping yet. And what I could do is apply color to this. Instead of making this like look black, I could actually come on here, click on this, and make my highlights any color that I wanted. So if I'm applying a custom color palette, I'd be able to do that. And so really I need a color palette. I'm going to open my swatches, and let's say I use this color palette that I pulled from kind of a beach scene at one point, just to see what that might look like applied to the fish. So in this case, I would actually select this light yellow for the highlights. Okay, I've got the highlights. So now I'm going to go ahead and switch to my quarter tones. Now, for the quarter tones here, what I'm going to do is turn them on, convert them to a smart object. And the reason I need to convert them is I can't really select them. Right now, they've got a blend mode, like a blend if on them in terms of the blending options. And so if I click with the control click on them, it would actually just select everything because all the pixels are still there. But if I turn it to a smart object, it will only represent the pixels that are showing. So when I convert to smart object, now it's only going to represent the pixels that are showing, and I can hit that control click to select all of the quarter tones in this case. And what I'll do is turn them into a solid color, and that makes a mask of all of those tones, so I still have that selection. And what I could do is apply a color, and in this case, I'm going to go ahead and apply this lighter yellow to those quarter tones. So I'll go ahead and click OK, and we can see how this is starting to stack. All right. By the way, if I ever wanted to reselect those quarter tones, I could, control click on here to reselect. If I wanted to make sure that I had each of my color separations maybe stored in a channel, I could simply save that selection. So I could go under the select menu and save the selection, and I could save it and give it a name. So maybe I call it my quarter tones channel. And now it's going to be saved into my channels. So I've got quarter tones as its own channel there. And that'd be another way to kind of color separate this out into channels. I don't really need that for my purposes here, but you can kind of see that that could be useful. I'm going to go ahead now to the midtones and do the same thing that I've been playing with here. So convert the midtones to a smart object, control click on them. So control click on that smart object. What's going on with my midtones? I can't select them. Let's see what I've done here. I'm going to go to my history and go back to where I converted it to a smart object, so that it's back. Maybe I just need to make sure I turn it on before I convert it into smart object and then convert to smart object. And now I should be able to select those midtones. There we go. Now I have a selection of the midtones. I can then add a solid color, and the color that I wanted was this midtone color. I'll go ahead and click OK. And I can turn off the smart object now. I'll switch to my 3/4 tones, turn it on, convert it to a smart object by right-clicking, control click on that smart object to make a selection, and then add an adjustment color solid fill based on the color I want for that. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And then finally, I've got my shadows. So do the same thing, turn the shadows on, convert to a smart object, control click on the smart object to select it, and then make a solid color fill with the color that you wanted for that final color, which is a little bit brown here. And I'm thinking maybe I'd like to have it be a dark. I could play with the colors. This is the color palette that I was kind of playing from, but what if this was more of a darker blue instead of a brown? I could see sort of what these different sort of palettes might look like. Okay, so I now have a custom color palette that I've applied here, and each of these colors is color separated. We could see what that looks like compared to the original image. I'm going to simply alt click on the original image just to toggle that on versus applying my own sort of custom color palette to have a more sort of graphic screen print. All right, so there we go. We've got this out. The last stage here, if I was actually going to screen print this, I'd want to prepare my transparencies and maybe create some traps so that I have just a little bit wider area. Because the way that I'll print this, if I was screen printing, is I'd actually sort of start with the lights and end with the darks. And so I wouldn't want to necessarily lay down a really light ink on top of black. I want to have my sort of black or my key or my darks to be the last sort of color to go down. To do that effectively, I don't want to have any gaps in between my colors if I have just a little bit of misregistration. So you have to plan for the imperfection of screen printing where you might not have perfect registration. So in this case, like I might prepare my transparencies. And so I'm going to go ahead and end by doing that. The way that I'm going to do that is take all my sort of color channels. I'm going to group these now. I'm going to group them into one group. And so that I've got kind of all of those things in one. I'm going to duplicate that group. And in the second group, I'm going to make my transparencies. So I'll call this my sort of transparencies. So these are the, the things that I can print and use to actually burn my screens. So for my colors here, what I want to do is have my, let's say I'm going to start with my lights. To do this, I'm going to go ahead and select the lights, and I'm going to control click on the color field to select just the highlights. Then what I'll do is create a layer here for those, and in that layer I'm going to use my fill to fill with black and my stroke to give a little bit of a trap, which is going to over expand that particular content, right? So that the highlights here are represented now all in black. And so I can turn off my selection now, but all of those highlights are black. Except, of course, that they're not. They are not all black. It looks like because I have my color here as light, I actually stroked with the wrong color. Let me redo it. I'll just get rid of that layer. Reselect my highlights by control clicking on the highlights mask that's there. I'm going to have a new layer and make sure I've got black as my foreground color, and then I'm going to both fill with black and I'm going to stroke that with the right color, in this case with black. Okay, so now I've got my highlights, and for the transparencies, and what I could do is just do this for the rest. So now I've got highlights. I'm going to go down to my 3/4 tones here, select those, create a layer for those, and these are for my quarter tones, I should say, quarter tones. And I want to fill with black and stroke. I could make an action of this so it goes a lot faster potentially, but now I can deselect, and what I've done is created a trap for these, right? There's actually overlap on these now. Then I'm going to go ahead and do that for the remaining ones. So I'll go to my midtones, which are right here. I'm going to select those, make a new layer for them, say edit, fill with black, and edit, stroke with black. All right, I now have my midtones. Let's go to the 3/4 tones, do the same thing here. So I've got those right here. Select them first, then I'll fill and stroke. And I don't need a stroke on my shadows. So the very last color here, I'll just make a selection of by clicking on it, and I'll create a layer for the shadows. This is the 3/4 tones. And then in the shadows, I'll simply fill with no stroke because I don't need to overprint the blacks. Those are the last piece. Once I've done all of this, you see that it should all turn black. So in this case, I've filled every part. I've got my shadows, I've got my 3/4 tones, my midtones, my quarter tones, and my highlights. And I've overprinted each of these just a little bit so that there's some overlap between the colors in case I misregister. At this point, I'd be able to print each of these on their own. So I could just print the highlights, separate that out into its own file, or just print it right from here and print that right to a transparency. If I want to sort of validate that this is working, I could still use some of my colors. And in this case, what I'll do is I'll create a solid color fill, and I could select my lights. And what I'll do is simply apply those with a clipping mask only to the highlights to sort of see just the highlights. And I could do that for each of these to sort of validate that this is still sort of working as I expect and that my transparencies are going to be correct. I could select the color that I want and then clip that, just in this case now, just to the quarter tones. I'll make a solid color fill and clip that just to the midtones, a solid color fill with my next color, and then what I'll do is clip that just to the 3/4 tones. And finally, I've got my shadows, right? So one of the things that you'll see with this too is that there should be some level of overlap between our colors. So like if I'm looking at the edge here of my highlights, and if I turn off those highlights, you can see that it overlaps, and that's the trap, right? It overlaps the quarter tones. And if I was to turn off my quarter tones, like let's look at the contact between those and the midtones, you'll notice that they also kind of, oops, I turned off the wrong one, but if I turned off those quarter tones, right, they overlap, looking like just kind of, oops, they actually overlap the 3/4 tones. That means that will help not have any gaps when we're printing this in case we get some level of misregistration. Okay, so I've got all of my transparencies. I've sort of validated that they have traps and they're ready to work. And so hopefully this has helped you if you're doing any screen printing or you're needing to do color separations, or if you're trying to apply your own custom color palette.